Folks, welcome to lecture number 5 in the 3H project. There's a few guests joining us tonight. I'm very pleased to say. You're in the presence of some eminent historians tonight. We'll have, in no order of preference, we'll have Professor Richard Grayson join us from Goldsmith. We have Assistant Professor Edward Burke from Nottingham University, and Dr. Nick Barron from, I got that one right, Nick, from Manchester. Now, the connection with these people, oh, by the way, sorry, and Gareth, obviously the man who made this all possible is Gareth Boyle, is joining us from the Heritage Lottery Fund as well, for at least the start of the lecture anyway. And I'm going to get Gareth to say a few words, but before I do, the reason why we're lucky to have Nick, Edward and Richard on is, first of all, the material we're going to cover tonight is now running into what's known as modern history. My grandmother, for example, will come up in this tonight because it's sort of a second learned memory. And it's difficult if you live in Northern Ireland to come to terms with the past. In fact, nobody has really done it yet. It's still a work in progress. This project is different because this project, as I said from the start, tackles it head on. So you're going to go run head into things like, clues in the 1920s, the successor not of the IRA, what the IRA did, what the UVF did. And it's exactly what I said at the start. We're going to tell it as it is. But for me, it was a learning process. And for an example of that, the books we're going to be using tonight, I'm going to refer to anyway. You have Jimmy McDermott's Northern Divisions. Okay, as I said, there'll be a bibliography at the end of the course, which details the C company of the IRA that operated in and around Brown Square and some of what they did. We have the British Army being deployed as a modern British Army on the streets of Belfast and in Brown Square. And for me as an ex-British soldier, that was extremely difficult. And I decided, because I'm part of the Irish School up at Queen's, I went to a lecture and I was going to pick a fight with this guy. Okay. And this guy is Edward Burke, because it says the British Army, an army of trades, British Army cohesion, deviancy and murder in Northern Ireland. And at the end of the lecture, I began to understand some of the things that I could never put together in my own mind as a British soldier. So I'm pleased to say Edward is on tonight. And when it comes to the UVF, this is a difficult subject because they haven't gone away, to some extent anyway. And so I keep hearing about forgotten heroes and, lost heroes and things like that. And then a few years ago, I discovered by accident The King of Karelia, okay, written by Nick Barron, who's on the call tonight. Because what I discovered was that the Battle of the Somme, you see me in my uniform at the Ulster Tower, and I didn't understand the meaning behind all of this until I read that book. So we're going to hear about the fighting colonel tonight, who campaigned in his uniform, and he is completely and absolutely forgot about, and still is forgot about. As I'm sure Nick will back me up, I've approached the Somme Association on numerous occasions, and nothing has come of it. You make your own mind up when you hear Lieutenant Colonel Woods' story. And last but not least, Professor Grayson, who very kindly pulled out all the stops, because last week I went through the number of men who I thought were killed at Brown Square, and I said that it doesn't compute. There's something not right. And I'm very pleased that I emailed Richard, who came back with what you're going to see at probably at the beginning, but I will certainly come in. But it really did, it emphasized to me that there's still stories to be told here. It's the right way to do it. So that being said, welcome to Mike King from Down County Museum. We'll be meeting Mike on our very last tour when we're heading down to Down County Museum. And Down County Museum will be featuring in the lecture tonight. So everybody's okay, I'm going to make a start. So I'm just going to share the screen. Hope this all works again. And of course, it doesn't. So shouldn't have spoke, sure, shouldn't. Okay. Everybody see that okay? Yep. Again, what I'm going to do, I'm going to keep the sidebar on and just go through the slides. Hopefully you'll all see them fine. So we should have been, we're now in lecture number 5. Oh, sorry, before I make a start, sorry. Gareth, I totally forgot. Sorry, I'm in really world of my owner. Would you like to unmute yourself for a second, Gareth, and say a few words?
Good evening, folks. My name is Gareth Boyle, and I'm the investment manager for the Heritage Lottery Fund. And Frank had an opportunity to apply for some funding to deliver this project, which we thought was very interesting and very good. So I'm just glad here to be part of it tonight. I'm going to keep it short and sweet. You're all very welcome, and it's good to see projects on the ground happening like this. That's talking about history and shared history, and look forward to seeing what comes of it at the end, and maybe something else can come of it in terms of progressing it for him. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Gareth. Thank you. Okay, folks, where we should have been is here, which is my sense of humour. Hitler's ball to the Ulster Unionist Belfast urban motorway, that is, but we're not. So we're here, just at BI Nixon, and as you know, the project was supposed to finish next week. It will finish next week. However, I'm going to volunteer until the project is completely over, which will be in June. So the lectures will go on until we finish the content, and then you should have received, or you will be receiving, tickets in the post, which is these, okay, which is for the tours. So that means that the project will continue on. So who's on the project? So to do a scoping exercise, what I did was all the guides who are on this project tonight, that's their home locations. It's only whenever I sat and plugged it in that I realised just how widespread the participants are on this course. And I thank you all for doing it. So from all the way from Newry, Newcastle, right up to Red Bay, Glenarth, even as far as East Belfast. So where are we? Well, we've covered the Home Rule Riots. We've covered the last charge of the Hussars in Wilson Street. So I wanted to cover this particular slide just one last time. And this is for Edward's beneficiary, because what you see here is Brown Square Barracks, and I think that's the Royal Scots Fusiliers in the bottom, and that's the Black Watch, because in his book he concentrates on Argyll and Southern Highlanders, which is a very emotive subject here. And I do remember the Scottish soldiers being here and what happened. And also, you didn't mess with the Scottish soldiers. So just wanted to point out that they were here and part of Brown Square. And if you remember last week, I had actually mapped out in 3D where the First World War soldiers who were killed here at Brown Square. So on the left is the map that I used from last week. And on the right is with the data now completed from Richard Grayson. I want to thank him for putting the effort into this, because we just in the few moments I've had to have a look at it, you can see, and I've just covered here, by the way, I now have all the data for Hamilton Street, John Street, Lower Falls, Carrickhill, and it's mind-blowing. But I've plugged these in because that was all the time I had to do it. But what I intend to do is cover the full gamut of Richard has sent me, because there is a hidden story here. You only have to look at both those views of what was supposed to be, what we were informed to be the people who had died in the First World War, and the actual deaths, and secondary deaths as well. So where are we? So whenever the troops come home, they were brutalized. We know what the First World War was like. They took life easily. All troops do once you learn how to kill. And this is the streets. This is Brown Square for those who are just joining us tonight. So this is actually Brown Square, which we remember was started away off back in 1780 with the United Irish Rebellion here. We've now worked our way up, and you can see how the streets have spread out. These marks you see on the map, by the way, are for next week, because this is the release points of German parachute mines. But I'll leave that the next week. But you can see how the streets built up around. This is looking towards the north. You can see streets like Lane Street, Sherbrooke Street, Upper Townsend Street. And this is where I was born, just here, just at Woodford Street. You can see the bars. We know that these bars were the attack points. It was especially it was for Catholic owners. It was a very easy way for people to get drink. And the trouble that began, the fire that was lit here in Wilson Street and West Street spread not just north and up and into what's now the Ardoyne, up and into the falls. It also spread across and into the east, especially whenever Harn the Wolf opened up. And so you had the same trouble, only more deadly, in a place called Ballymacarrett. So just as you go over the bridge. So we can't tell all the story of all those people, not tonight anyway. So again, we're going to focus on three people. On the left, you have what you're going to find out to be Lt Col Philip Woods. In the middle, we'll have James Patterson in Townsend Street. He joined the UVF, as I said, and then he joined the Royal Ulster Rifles. And over here, we'll have Fred Crawford in South Africa. We just got the home rule. And this is really where we left off last week. So home rule had been postponed. The troops came home. The question still hadn't happened, but Ireland had changed. It very much was unfinished business. So I'll just bring these over. Okay, so the problem was the handling of Easter Rising and execution of most of its leaders was a critical strategic mistake by the British government through the powers given to its British commander, General Sir John Maxwell. Asquith himself warned Sir John Maxwell that anything like a large number of executions would sow the seeds of lasting trouble in Ireland. And if you think back to William III explaining to De Ginkle that he had to make a fair and equitable settlement with Catholics, otherwise the same thing's going to happen again. So nobody learned from history in this particular thing. At daybreak then, William Cosgrave, whose cell in Kilmainham was next to that of Major John McBride. Now McBride served in the Irish Brigade in South Africa. So he then, through a chink in the door, I could barely discern the receding figures, silence for a time, then the sharp crack of rifle fire, then silence again. I thought my turn would come next, and I waited for a rap on the door, but the firing squad came no further that morning. That afternoon, Cosgrave learned from a priest that his death sentence had been commuted. The remaining rebels were interned at Frongoff internment camp and also on a tender up here in Belfast, where most people will agree the modern 20th century IRA was born in embryo, mostly through the organisation of Michael Collins, but it had the short-term success of isolating the revolutionaries from Ireland. So internment was a short-term fix. It was never a long-term fix. And this photograph here is the actual internment camp in Frongoff. But you can see that even during the war, the people had realised that Britain was on a collision course. These medals were struck by the German, and you can see even they realised that home rule, they were using those as propaganda. So they had learned from the likes of Carson, who used mass propaganda techniques. So to strike a medal and then hand the medal out. So you can see RIP, home rule. So you can imagine the Irish troops, where these would have found their way to them. The message was very simple. There was no mixed messages here. So there you have the British spade through the Irish heart. And if you look at the top, you'll see General Maxwell, killer, Ireland. So simple message, and the message was brought into the trenches across the world to the Irish troops. We're going to talk about this man here. I'm sorry, I knew his granddaughter, but never knew him. He died before I was around. So he trained at Donard Lodge. So he joined the UVF, and then he joined the Royal Irish Rifles and the Ulster Rifles. And then he trained at Ballykilner Camp with the Royal Irish Rifles, the 9th Battalion of the West Belfast, the Shankill Battalion. What saved his life, instead of going to the Battle of Somme, he took a severe kidney infection in April 1916, and they had to ship him home. And he then ended up doing guard duty for a while until he came back. But he returned in, I think it was November 1916. So he took part in Ypres, Messines, and lots of other battles. So he won the military medal and the DCM, the Distinguished Conduct Medal, in 1917. And this is a citation. Now, we haven't got a citation for the military medal. This is just for the DCM. So for conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty, when a tank had been put out of action, this NCO crawled to the rescue of the wounded crew and dragged them under heavy machine gun fire to a place of safety. Later in the day, when a strong enemy party was observed advancing on the flank of his platoon, his prompt use of a machine gun to disperse the enemy inflicted heavy casualties. So whenever he came home, and this is a picture that appeared in Belfast Telegraph, I think. So he became a sergeant. And at the time he lived in Melbourne Street, which was terrible housing, absolutely terrible. When he came home, he was able to move about 50 yards into a fantastic house in Townsend Street that had a parlour, one of the few houses in the area that had a parlour. So he did well, but when he came home, he also became a prisoner of war guard. Now, I'm not sure where he was a guard. We think it was in France, but that's something we're still trying to find out. He had been trained as a soldier to obey orders without question and to implement those orders through his squad once he was promoted to sergeant. And that is the way of the British Army. And this is why I'm glad that Edward's on the call tonight, because there are rogue soldiers. You know, in every apple or every barrel, there's rotten apples. And there are soldiers who will murder. It's quite simple. We know that. How they're dealt with is another matter, but get that straight from the outset. So for James, the promises made by politicians toward the end of the war raised expectations in their ranks that their lives would improve when they did return to Ireland. And the local press had really played this up. Homes for heroes, full employment when you go back. So the reality was somewhat different, and Patterson married Elizabeth Griffith and moved to Townsend Street after finding work in the Belfast Corporation at Falls Park. Now, this is a contemporary poster. Don't pity a disabled man, find him a job. These guys came home. There was no jobs. Literally, there was a boom in the shipyards, but their places have been taken because of the war. The shipyards and the mills and the heavy engineering had taken on people to fill their places, including women to fill their places. So whenever they come home, there was a lack of work. Now, this particular photograph is taken exactly where James's house stood, and this is Townsend Street, and that's his granddaughter, his great-granddaughter, his great-great-granddaughter, and his great-great-great-great-granddaughter. And if you notice, his house actually stands on the peace line. Actually, it was right on where the peace line is today. So if you're taking tours up Townsend Street, remember when you're passing that peace line that James Patterson house once stood there. So what was housing like in Brown Square? This was Brown Square. So this was what's called the Bull Ring. It was Catholics, but this was built in place where this is Protestant housing. This is just, I'm actually looking out my window of what this would have been. This is Abbey Street. You can see the photographer's kid, wee girl there, has shoes. Nobody else does have shoes. This photograph on the left This is exactly as I remember it when I grew up. So this is Brown Street, and over here is Melbourne Street. And you can see that these houses would have been thatched. You can see they've got tin on their roofs. So these were still there when I was going to school. The school is just here. This young lad's kicking a ball across. And this is a shop that I would have went over to. So this is looking down Brown Street. So over here would have been where Henry Joy McCracken and the Northern Committee of the Irish United Irishmen would have met. So here you have Malloy's Public House, and you can see the mills in the background here. Kelly's stables would have been for Kelly's coal, their horses, but you can see the rear of houses here. You can see this one here has like a matting on it, but you can see the back, they're derelict, and people still lived in these. So this is 1912. These would have been still in existence whenever James Patterson came home. This is the same look only this time we're looking. So the photographer, that previous photographer, would have been standing on this building. So looking down, so this is actually Brown Street. And you can see the old housing here, which why it was gone by the time I was here when I lived here. But you see the school in distance, and you can see the spire of Townsend Presbyterian Church here. So for Irish soldiers coming home for the Ulster Division, they wanted jobs, security, home rule put to the background. For the Irish, they had been promised they were going to get home rule and their own parliament. So you can see here that in the 1918 election, it was a real shoe-in for Sinn Féin, because simply what they were saying is, look what you did for other small nations. You want us to go and fight for the rights of small nations. We want to be a small nation, and you won't let us. And so for a lot of people here, for a year at least, because of the disaster that was the First World War, it settled things here, but only because of the depth of feeling and mourning that there was. That all changed. So, and it changed in 1919, because by 1919, people had had enough of the excuses of wartime. We'll have to do it. We'll have to fight. The boys are at the front. You should do your bit. So there were already tensions in the major manufacturing works, as wages had been increased during the war boom years, and the former soldiers' jobs have been taken by other men as war work, and women, and rightly so. And remember, a lot of these men, until the age of 21, no matter where they served, they weren't even entitled to the vote. So things aren't the way they appear to be. At the end of Armistice Week in 1918, Lord Perry, the head of Harnham Wolf, demanded the men must still work the hours they had volunteered to work during the war, which is 54 to 65 hours per week. As he said, there must be no slackening of effort in the shipyards. So on the 14th of January 1919, 20,000 men downed tools and marched to Belfast City Hall, and this was virtually unheard of. There had been a dockers' strike, but certainly the shipyards would have taken a very aloof attitude towards that. Remember, even unionisation here in Belfast was segregated by this stage. The mayor asked the British Army to intervene, and General Shan deployed enough troops in 6 armoured cars to protect strike breakers. So the British Army was deployed here in 1919 to break the strikes, and they happened to still be here whenever the conflagration was about to happen. The strike was broken, but the hours were reduced, and one of the things that did win the right for was the end of half-timers. So some children at Brown Square School would have went to school in the morning and then worked in the afternoon, or vice versa. That ended as part of this strike. But worryingly for the Unionist party, it also seen nationalist and Unionist strike leaders uniting in these class issues: wages, unemployment, housing, basic what we now consider to be basic rights, I hope. And Labour councillors were elected to Belfast City Council for Sandy Row and the Shankill. Sam Kyle. Now, Sam Kyle was a former soldier who came home and studied what the Labour movement meant. And this particular photograph here, as you can see, Dr. White, who was the mayor at the time, being attacked, And I'm looking at this and just thinking Bristol. You know, I wonder if the mayor of Bristol would have driven through the streets, but it's something very similar, okay? But you can see that this depth of feeling that men who were disunited before, who, you know, there's this misconception that whenever soldiers joined up, they all fought together, all pals together. That's not strictly true. It only happened on very few occasions. Most times the Irish regiments were kept strictly separate. The 10th, the 16th and 32nd, 36th. So for these men to unite and actually start attacking unionist establishment was a massive shock to the unionist system. So much so, in the Irish general election in 1918, Sinn Féin swept the board. So a party that came from nowhere, remember, it used to be the Irish Parliamentary Party. That was the days of O'Connell and Charles Stewart Parnell. They were literally swept out. And this is why. And for anybody who lives through the Troubles, you know, we remember the hunger strikers like being put up for election and winning elections. So put them in to get them out. Vote for McGuinness, the man in jail for Ireland. And so, regardless of the pressure, the British government still prevaricated. And so, in 1919, as we know, the Soloheadburg quarry shootings with Don Breen happened, and it started the Irish Revolutionary War of Independence. So the days of talking was over. So learning from the fixed positions in Easter Rising, and also learning from what they had gained in Frongoff camp, their tactics was more akin to the Boer War. In fact, it was an Irish brigade in the Boer War. Now, for the British Army, that's problematical because they're set up, and they would have been set up in the First World War to fight fixed positions. But the IRA had learned not to do that and to use guerrilla tactics. So how were the British Army going to deal with that? They were up against the Royal Irish Constabulary, who were armed as a paramilitary police force, but who had little or no knowledge of counter-terrorism techniques. It simply didn't exist, except those who had fought in the Boer War. The RIC officers were isolated, and the IRA used flying columns to maximise their forces, tactical experience and weapons. So rather than waiting on the British Army to deploy and hit them, they hit, ran, and only took on the RIC if they had overwhelming numbers or weapons. The British government tried to stop the escalation of the violence by not deploying the British Army fully and reinforcing the RIC with black and tans and auxiliaries. So they didn't want to make a war out of it or appear to until it was much too late. So they tried to reinforce it and class it as a police operation. So they deployed guys, and these are guys who would have served in the First World War. They didn't have enough uniforms for them, so therefore they had some RIC uniforms that were black, and they wore their khakis and also their puttees. And incredibly, whenever I joined the army in 1978, these were my standard issue puttees. Things didn't move that far. But the tactics became more and more vicious, because how could these men take on these men if they're hiding in the countryside or in amongst the population? And as things became more desperate, so then things began to get out of control on both sides. In Belfast, you can see here, the fires were lit by a speech by Lord Carson. There's the man himself. And on his left is a guy who will come up next week, Lord Castlereagh. So at the speech at the field in July 1919, they literally lit the flames. It was very much blood and thunder. You know, the revolutionaries are coming over the hills, and it was very much also Reds under the bed. They started to equate Sinn Féin and Republicans with Bolsheviks. You know, it's if we don't stop it here, look what happened in Russia. And remember, the Russian Revolution was only a year and a half past. So that was the sort of atmosphere that you had. So This is Hansard, which is the official state record of what was said in Parliament. So the 16th of July 1919. So Major Murdoch Wood asked the Prime Minister whether his attention had been drawn to a speech delivered by the Right Honourable and learned member for Dunkern Vision of Ballymonach on the 12th of July instant, in which he announced his intention of calling out the Ulster Volunteers and in summoning provisional government if His Majesty's government attempted to put in force the Government of Ireland Act, Home Rule. Whether this declaration is an incitement to direct action against constitutional authority, or whether, in view of the fact as a member of the government took part in a demonstration at which the speech was made, does the government approve of such action? So at the time, the Prime Minister, Bonar Law, he was in a cleft stick, as they say, because essentially Carson was a friend. So I suggested one of these questions. I've consulted the law officers and I've advised there is no ground upon which His Majesty's government could take legal action with regard to the speech referred to. Now, to be honest with you, the speech was such, you're going to see the consequences of that speech in a moment, because before that, there was this growing movement between the working classes of better jobs, better housing. After this speech, we went back to the war politics again. And this is a guy called Mr. Joseph Devlin, who was born in Hamel Street. So Joe was born 200 yards from where I'm sitting here. So he knew exactly what the street politics were. I was repeatedly interrupted, and you have not risen to call me to order. The question I have put is this, and I want an answer to it. We are three humble men imprisoned for making socialistic speeches on the Custom House steps at Belfast, have been sentenced to 6 months imprisonment and forcibly fed for suggesting direct action to the workers, while statesmen in this House, ex-law officers and ministers of the Crown can make far worse speeches without a word of condemnation. Because what Carson had done was light the fires of sectarianism. When it comes to Joe Devlin, that's actually John Redmond and the Irish Volunteers, and that's Joe Devlin just there. So Joe very much supported the Irish Volunteers, and he was very much a socialist, but he realised and he knew what was going to happen. And cartoon at the time, you can see the Sunday Independent. Hang on, it's going to go sit a row. So maybe it's a whitewash. So Carson's speech did what he normally does, incite people. And what happened was the disaster in the shipyard. So on the 20th of July, a new organisation of Protestants, labour workers, they went into the shipyard and attacked all Catholics and also socialist Protestants who were termed rotten prods. At least one was killed. We don't know how many were killed in the end because of different injuries. But it wasn't just in Harnawolf, it was all over Queen's Island. So really what Carson had done was light the fires to split the workforce down the middle. Now, I put these photographs up because they illustrate over time that once Carson lit that fire, it never went out. So if you think, that we have fair employment legislation here, we had the Flags and Emblems Act and all this good stuff. But until we had that, and there's still some element of that, we had this, and I worked in Hollywood for 20 years. This, for example, is the engine works. This is the electrical manufacturing shop. So you'll see an orange parade going through the engine works with a banner, and you'll see the sword. Okay, it's the same guy with the sword, and now they're marching up, and this is the joiner's shop. So they would have paraded. This is the 12th, the day that the shipyard went on holiday, the 12th of July. This is what was done every single year. So if you imagine you're a Catholic, what message does this send to you? Is this fair? Is this your shipyard? I know there's a couple of men here who work down at Titanic Belfast now, which is exactly where this building is, because here in the background you can see what is now Titanic Hotel, and you'll see how many men are marching this procession. You can see by the 1950s that you can see justice denied, and you can see is before the formation of the state. So and it became more and more organised. Now people will say, well, that was the past, the well, what's that got to do, you know, with Brown Square? Well, this is the shipyard when I was there. Okay, so that electrical shop is still there. The boathouse is gone, but this is now Belfast Metropolitan College. And what you're seeing on the left here is the same march, and this is about 1993. You'll see now it's paramilitary flags. It's now not the Orange Order. It's paramilitary. Here you have a Protestant Action Force. You have the UFF. And over here you have a guy called George Seawright. And he was assassinated by INLA, I think, because one of the statements he made was that he would prefer to burn Catholics as a way of dealing with the problems in Northern Ireland. You can see the marched all around the ship. This is 1993, by the way. So this guy here is Jim Farr. I work with Jim Farr. And they're walking past. So in the background would be where Titanic Hotel is, just there. So they went all over the shipyard. And then they went all over, right down in towards the aircraft factory was. It wasn't just Harn and Wolf. So here you can see they've got the paramilitary trappings there. Okay. But you can see the drummers in the front here. This is 1993. So the fires at Carson Knit have lasted a long time. Whether or not they're out is still a matter of conjecture. And this is Belfast. So if you notice here, you know, we're going back now into Brown Square. You have Castle Junction. You have revolver duels. You have sniper fire on trams. Because the tactics of the IRA in Belfast could not be the same as the tactics of the IRA flying columns. So it had to be hit and run, but in a different way. So you can see area of fires of Spur groceries, because most of the Spur groceries would have been owned by Roman Catholics. So easy targets. You know, they would have opened up these Spur groceries in Protestant areas, and as soon, which is fine. Same thing happened at Brown Square. At times of peace, great. First time things goes wrong, there's the first houses to go up. So the question of proving your loyalty was then out of the sectarian battle lines, because John Kyle, for example, was an ex-soldier, and yet he was one of the men put out of the shipyard. And the reason he was put out of the shipyard because he refused to sign an oath of loyalty to the Queen to work in the shipyard. So being a soldier, going to war, gaining medals, losing your family in war was no longer enough to be part of this Northern Ireland that was starting to shape. So here you can see Michael Dunn, Brown Street, charged with a riot, stated by Constable Gordon of throwing stones in a riot in Wilson Street. You know, and I'm hoping now most of the people on this call will start recognize where all these places are, because it's exactly the same place where the riot took place in 1815. So we're now 104 years later. Down here, you'll see Constable John Crullers. Sergeant Peckham said that military patrol was passing through Millfield about 5 p.m. today. There was a crowd of men at the corner of Samuel Street. The patrol called on the men to stand and put up their hands. Instead, shots were fired at the patrol from the crowd, which then ran away. The patrol fired after them. The witnesses observed a number of men did not run away, but crouched and lay down. These men were ordered to put up their hands and advance, and the fire. 5 prisoners came forward. Each prisoner then was cautioned. That could be Bloody Sunday. The one thing I will say, of the troops at that range had wanted to kill in the crowd with the rifles that they had, it would have been no issue. So I'm presuming they would have fired high to get the crowd to disperse. But I'm presuming that. I don't know. Maybe they're bad shots. So you can see up here. So Sergeant Reagan stated that the accused ran into his own house, and Constable Waller, who stated the prisoner was throwing paraffin on burning furniture, said he was positive of the prisoner's identity. So Robert Hutchison, a private in the Royal Irish Rifles, a prisoner leave from the Isle of Wight, was remanded for a week on a riot charge. It was alleged the prisoner led a riotous mob against the police at Donegal Pass in the evenings. 4 men, so you see North Boundary Street, Mateer Street, because now it's not just Brown Square, it's the areas adjacent to Brown Square is now where this happened. And so I'm going to come to just a few entries in the diary of Fred Crawford, because Fred had came home, but he had still kept the weapons, or most of them, in his works in Wilson Street, which is one of the reasons why the riot was taking place there. And he also armed the local population. So this is the 6th of September 1920. For the last few days, things were much quieter. Last week, my men got a bit nervous of being rushed. The gate was kept open all the time. It was quite possible that rushing would take place, especially as some of the low-class Roman Catholic women came around the foreman when he was opening the gate and threatened that the place would be burned down if he opened the works. And that was a military strategy on behalf of the IRA. It was called incendiarism. So a lot of employment places, factories, mills and things like that were burnt to the ground as part of a military strategy, because they had little ways to attack. First of all, they didn't really mostly attack the British Army. They were after the RIC and the B Specials, the USC, whenever they were formed. But they also wanted to take on the government, so they did that through economic warfare. So, and we all remember, if you lived here and during the Troubles, the city centre being blitzed to hell, bombed to hell with fire bombs. This was reported to me. I had a chat with 3 ex-servicemen who said they would feel quite safe and contented if they had something with which to defend themselves. I served them out with 3 revolvers, service revolvers, and 10 rounds each to keep in their pockets while they were working. It struck me how history repeated itself. Here our men were working with their weapons on them, as the Jews did in the time of the prophet Nehemiah at the building of the wall of Jerusalem about 445 BC. Now, I'll not read all of that, but you can see that Crawford believed that he was acting on the orders of God, and that these Protestants were building the walls, just as the walls of Derry. They were making a very simple jump of this is why we're doing this. But he armed his own workers with weapons. That's the point of this one. The next one then. I told the boys around that if they had any weapons, they were around, by the way, it was around his works in Wilson Street and Brown Square, to hide them so that they could not possibly be found, that the houses might be searched any time. Unfortunately, one young fellow did not take the advice I gave the others. He was not at the private meeting. He had a pin-fire revolver, practically a toy for all the good it is, lying at the head of his bed, and the soldiers and police found it. He was arrested and taken to barracks. About 100 soldiers and 30 police raided the district at 4 o'clock this morning. They went into the only one Roman Catholic court where scarcely any men lived, it being chiefly inhabited by low-class women. I do not know where they got anything there. When I got down, I had, of course, to start to help this man. His name was John Pritchard. I got in touch with Mr. Graham, the best solicitor in the police courts, and sent him a note to say that I would go bail for their prisoner. Now, this is 1920. This is after the war. This is after the UVF had allegedly gone to the 36th Ulster Division. I reported the matter to Unionist headquarters and also UVF headquarters, and they will do what they can for him. I decided to get all my rifles and revolvers and ammunition put away. I got John Thompson, Robert Johnson, and Ernest Knowles to come to the works, and we've seen Ernest Knowles' photograph outside, and get all snugly stowed away in their hiding places. The large quantity of rifle ammunition I can't hide at present, which was in excess of 500,000 rounds, so no wonder he couldn't get rid of it. If the military do search and I find this and they find this, I shall also be detained. Where they will put me, I do not know. I do not fancy Victoria Barracks guardrooms. I much prefer the jail. The point there, unwittingly, what Crawford's saying is that the British Army weren't involved in this, and if they had caught him, he would have been arrested and taken to Victoria Barracks. And strangely enough, Victoria Barracks was his headquarters during the First World War. So the notion that the British Army worked hand in glove, I'm not saying they were perfect, but with the UVF post-war is, as I'm hopefully going to prove, is not 100% correct. The next one, an armoured car was passing through Wilson Street. As it passed the Roman Catholic quarters opposite the works, that's at Letitia Street, a Protestant woman heard the following conversation between 2 Roman Catholics. Oh, it's all very well to search our houses, but if they would do the right quarter not far from here, they would get plenty of what they were looking for, referring to firearms ammunition. I no doubt this is partly true. So for fear of getting my arms confiscated, so again, they would have packed them down inside starch barrels, and this is where they were kept at Brown Square. The thing about the First World War was that for the first time, weapons of and contacts mass destruction have been used. Those weapons were machine guns. We know that Crawford had at least 12 at one stage in or around Brown Square, and they would probably by then would have been moved out. But to give you an idea of what it was like here at Brown Square in 1920, when we get into West Street, there was a Lancia car with ace specials in it. They were full-time police, about 20 yards from us. They were blazing away at everything with trousers on it with a Lewis gun. When they got to the bottom of West Street, they turned to the right of Smithfield Market and went on blazing down King Street. So I'll stop at that particular point, because what's happening now is Lewis guns are being used, which are portable machine guns. So technology has moved on. That meant that the technology of the battlefield was coming to Belfast. And this is where it happened. And again, I have this one in here for Edward. You can see, and I think that is Argyle and Southern Highlanders there. And this is exactly the same place as I showed this last week. This is the corner of Peters Hill and what was in Upper Library Street, now is Carrickhill. So just as the RIC lined up in the 1890s, here you can see the British Army. So this is Carrickhill, this is Peters Hill, this is Upper North Street, you can see here. And this is the same spot about 1970. And you can tell because the British Army at that stage of the game were still making sandbag positions. So, say Brown Square, it has a lot of history. So what was the IRA? What did it do? Well, and the opposite forces here at Brown Square was C Company, and they were commanded by Robert Brennan. And our main area was around Elton Street, Carrickhill, Millfield, and Divis Street. That come under the 3rd Northern Division, which would have answered directly or indirectly to Michael Collins and the IRA High Command in Dublin. But they did have their own remit. So Seamus Woods, for example, was a member of C Company. So he's believed to have shot dead William Twiddell, who's going to play another partner story later on in North Street. But also, as part of the IRA's plan to move the conflict north, once the War of Independence had sort of the truce had been called, they planned the very first attack of what would have been a combined force of the IRA stroke the Free State forces, and it was going to be at Brown Square Barracks, where they were going to take over the barracks, and they had arranged with an insider, an RIC IRA man. So informers were on both sides. He was going to let them in. They had 2 Crossley tenders with machine guns and whatever ammunition they were, because the IRA were desperate for weapons and ammunition. On the night, the guy let them down. So they swapped, and they actually, Seamus Woods and C Company IRA attacked Hastings Street Barracks, which is only 300 yards from where I'm sitting. They weren't they did break in, they did get some weapons, but not the weapons that they were after, which was the machine guns mounted on the armoured cars. So what about James Patterson? So James joined the V Specials, and this is a really rare photograph. It's only one I know of. And so this is if you have a look, this is the Balmoral Guard of the Ulster Special Constabulary. And this is August 1921. So then you can see that RIC, that had become the A, B, and C specials. Now, James was a full-time officer, so he had been classed as A, but he would have sat in with B as well. But you can see how prominent he is in that he's sitting beside the officer. Now, I do have this expanded, but you can see the amount of men. This is just one company that was needed. And this is, as you can imagine, I wouldn't have wanted to argue with James. I don't think he would have been the type that would have taken argument too well. But you can see his medals are actually more than the officers. The officer you can see that looks like the crown of the Royal Irish Rifles. So you can see there was still in the 1920s, there was still this mixture, but by then the B specials, A specials were fully kitted out, and they became a paramilitary police force. I know that Edward is researching into what became of the paramilitaries. This is the one I know of. There's two here at Brown Square, but this is a guy called Hoogie Walker, and his family lived in Boyd Street. Now, we think he was one of the Ulster Imperial Guards who actually were based at Wilson Street with Frederick Crawford. Crawford tried to create his own forces, one of which was Crawford's Tigers, and the other one was Ulster Imperial Guards that he dabbled with. But Hoogie Walker was a known gunman, and as his family would say, he disappeared for months on end to America and came back very rich. And we think he went with a guy called Buck Alec Robinson, who is a legend over here in Northern Ireland as a guy who kept a land in his backyard, but who was a UVF gunman. Now, what they were doing in America, I'll certainly put you in touch with the guy who gave me information, and you can chase that one down. But that was a nice one to find, Hoogie Walker. So what happened in the rest of the world? Well, the Connaught Rangers, of which I told you I was the notional head of here, they had heard through the letters what was happening here in Ireland. And so in 1920, they rebelled. That there was a mutiny. So the British Army, as they do, they have systems for doing this. And in the end, they executed one guy, Daly, I think he was called, by James Daly. He really was just the unlucky guy because there was lots more involved in the mutiny. He was just the one that was picked on. Whenever partition did finally happen, the Connaught Rangers marched to Windsor and they handed in their colours, where they are still there today. And there you can see the President of Ireland, I like to call him my Uncle Mick, Auntie Sabina, and I'm not going to mention who that is, but this is Windsor Chapel, and he's pointing out the colours of the Irish regiments that still are there today. And here you can see the Connaught Rangers forming up outside the GPO in the 1930s, still as proud, but still as proud Irishmen. They had done their duty, they'd handed in their colours, and for them, their loyalties belonged to the new state. This is the IRA's war record that was captured in a raid in St Mary's Hall, which isn't too far from here. I'll cover that in a moment. So you can see it was very accurate, as accurate as they could get it, of what was actually happening. And you can see the big thing for the IRA in the north here was whenever there was a pact between Sir James Craig, so someone who said he would never talk to the IRA stroke Sinn Féiners, he actually went down and talked, and there was a truce, and it gave the IRA here in the north time to reorganise. So that's why the killing fields of Brown Square wasn't so bad in 1919 and early 1920, but 1921 the IRA had become better armed, better supplied, more used to taking on the flying column, taking on the British Army flying column. So some men came north and brought the experience with them. Here you can see May the 23rd, W.J. Tweddale shot in Garfield Street, also a mine laid in Cornmarket Square. And there's a famous photograph of a fireman pouring water down a manhole in Cornmarket, trying to stop this. So you can see the burning of Wordy's Mill here in Mill Street and Millers and Martins of Millfield. And that was right beside Fred Crawford's works. So Fred had a point in protecting his works, but not whenever you arm people. But whenever law and order breaks down, people make whatever choices they make to stay alive. And this is the reality here, at Brown Square. But the reality for what happened, you can see, for example, this would have been the corner of North Street. There's a big hoard in there today, but you can see a Lewis gun here. So you can see machine guns being deployed. And typical British soldiers, speaking as one myself, one's having a smoke, the other one's daydreaming in the middle of nowhere, one's trying to clean his rifle. The corporal is looking the other direction, that's par for the course there. And you can see here, fingers on triggers, British troops patrol Belfast. Their fingers aren't on the triggers, I can assure you. They're along the trigger guard, because that's something that's beat into every soldier. But you can see that the propaganda around the British Army, that they had been deployed to attack Catholic areas, had already begun. And you can see here the Weekly Kentucky Irish American, without naming any publications, complained that accounts in many daily papers create the impression that Sinn Féin is to blame for the riots, but also noted significantly little paragraphs betray the real cause of disorders as Orange men and the British government. The Catholics of Belfast are simply defending themselves. Likewise, the Gaelic American cited reporting from the Irish News, a nationalist newspaper in Belfast, about Catholics being driven from their homes and the premises were taken by possessing Protestant families. So in there you have a modicum of truth. But as we've now learned in this course, the worst lies of all are wrapped up in half-truths. Yes, British soldiers were not exactly perfect, as I have said, but they certainly did not take prisoners on either side when they were deployed in the 1920s. And here you have a modern picture. I just wanted to put this in, because this is Hastings Street Barracks, and this would have been 1970. So here you can see the old knife rests that were brought in here in 69. You can see Divis Towers in the background. And if you think back to the 57th Regiment, the Foot, that guy who had been cut along his heels, that would have happened just about here. So things hadn't really changed. So what was it like? Well, this map was drawn by this man, Father Hassan, who was a parish priest of the Catholic Church here at Brown Square, St Mary's. So he actually drew out a map of where the killing fields were. So I'm just trying to get a balance here. Divis Street. So here you can see along here Millfield, and here you can see West Street. This is where Crawford's Bleach Works would have been. So you can see this area here, the area adjacent Brown Square, and all around here, and Ballymacarrot, because of the shipyard, was the killing fields. And the IRA had sent one of their commanders north to help out. So just in the interest of fairness, bearing in mind, I've explained that Frederick Crawford became an inspector, district inspector in the B Specials. This guy here was sent north, and his name was Owen O'Duffy. And he was the IRA liaison officer at St Mary's in Chapel Lane. And he then became the Garda Commissioner in 1922. So playing devil's advocate, if you were a Protestant who lived in Donegal after partition, and this guy was your Garda Commissioner, you know, it wouldn't look good. And what made it worse was that this is the same man here when he created his own political party, Fine Gael, who were fascists. So, but that's on just speaking on fascism. We'll come to D.I. Nixon. The most notorious killings of all were carried out in retaliation, and I'm going to sort of call it out here. So D.I. Nixon, we know at the very, very start of these lectures, I explained about him buying his house, instructing the builders to dig down 10 feet to make sure there was no remains of the Catholic Irish left underneath his house, because he knew it was an ancient Irish hill fort, Iron Age. So he was a well-known person. And you can see November 1920, he returned to Belfast to take charge of 0 Division of the police at Brown Square. Since that date, he's been, and by the way, this is the private files of Michael Collins. Since that date, he's been foremost in organising and carrying out all kinds of persecution of the nationalist population. He played a big part in the organisation of these specials. At the time, the IRA began to claim official attention in the shape of reprisals. The first of the series occurred after disarming a number of police and the shooting of 2 constables in the Falls Road. So that's the famous Raglan Street. So you can go up there and still see at the back of the peace line there where that actually happened. So here you have another clip. It was afterwards learned from constables. So this is intelligence from inside the RIC on what Nixon's activities were going to Michael Collins, who was then the head of the IRA. It was afterwards learned that constables who were working in intelligence for us that Constable Gill in the Brown Square Barracks had seen County Inspector Harrison, D.I. Nixon, and Constable Pakenham driving a Ford car down to Shankill and Bray Street a few minutes after the murder of McGarvey. So these guys, they couldn't deal with guerrilla tactics, urban guerrilla tactics. So they believed that the only way they could do it and was the target Sinn Féin, armed or unarmed, and if anybody got in their way, or if they were just intent on killing, then they just killed, no matter who those people were. So the final reprisal occurred on the last Saturday, April 22, shortly after the Collins Creek Pact. And from the facts, it appears to be deliberately contrived to break the negotiations then going on between the Army Command of the IRA and Ulster. So Nixon was starting to play a political role as well, because he wanted the pact to break down. On the Old Lodge Road, a policeman was doing duty alone at the corner of the Loyalist Street. Brown Street Barracks is 6 stories high and commands the entire locality, and policemen have also been witnessing sniping from a barrack roof in the adjoining nationalist areas. A shot was fired and the policeman fell dead. His Constable Turner, I think his name was. From the position he was standing in, it would be impossible for the shot to have been fired from a nationalist district at the period from under the control of 2nd Battalion Belfast Brigade. I don't sort of wear that one. I reckon he was shot by the IRA, because if they had a crack at someone, they would have done it, But again, what you have here is one person's view of what happened. What happened next is without dispute, but this is the lead up to it. So it must be taken that this shot was fired by some of his fellow policemen to provide the desired excuse for the reprisal that immediately followed, and it's named here reprisal. So, and this is what happened. About 10 officers in Brown Square Barracks, upon hearing of the killing, took a Lancia armoured car and went touring the Republican national streets in the area. When they dismounted their vehicle, witnesses heard them shouting, "Cut the guts out of him," for the murder of Turner. The first victim was John McCrory, who lived in Stanhope Street, just across the road from where Constable Turner had been shot. The police broke into his house and shot him dead in the kitchen. In Park Street, father of 7, Bernard McKenna, was killed while lying in bed. Finally, the police arrived in Arnon Street. William Spallon, aged 70, lived at 16 Arnon Street, who had just returned from the funeral of his wife, who had also been killed in conflict. His 12-year-old grandson, Gerald Tamilby, witnessed his death. 2 men came into the room. One was in the uniform of a policeman. They asked my grandfather's name, and he said William Spallon. The man in plain clothes fired 3 shots at him. When I cried out, he said, "Lie down, or I'd put a bullet into you." Tamilby said the killers then took £20 that his grandfather had used to pay for his wife's funeral. The attackers then used a sledgehammer to break into the house next door, where they found Joseph Walsh, who was an ex-soldier, in bed with his 7-year-old son Michael and his 2-year-old daughter Bridget. Joseph Walsh was bludgeoned to death with a sledgehammer, while Michael Walsh, the boy, 7-year-old, was shot and died from his wounds the next day. Another son, Frank, aged 14, was shot in the thigh but survived. A local man, George Murray, described the aftermath of the attack. One of the 3 policemen had revolvers, and the other 2 had guns. The men went out. Immediately after, 7 armed men, 5 in police uniform and 2 in civilian clothes, entered. There's no doubt that this was carried out by Nixon and a squad, a killing squad, because they couldn't deal with the tactics that was being used by the IRA. The very next day, 29 Brown Street, the attack happened at the Donnelly family. So the most notorious murder of Brown Street was the bombing of the Donnelly family at number 29, which is still standing today. It's now a Airbnb. So essentially, in return for what happened in Arnon Street, the IRA attacked Francis Brown. Now, he was a well-known Orange man, but we don't think it had any connections at all with some Ulster Imperial Guards or anything like that. But if you look, it was little Isabel who received the first intimation of the arrival of the raiders. As already stated, she was behind the front door, which had 2 large glass panels, and her attention was attracted by the sound of footsteps in the hall. Looking up, she see 2 or 3 men with revolvers in their hands. Then she heard a voice calling, "Wait a minute." She looked across to her father to attract his attention, but it was too much engrossed in the newspaper. Immediately there was a crash of glass as a message of death, which was a grenade, came hurling through the window and exploded in the middle of the family circle with terrific force. To cut a long story short, the 2 children were blown up and into the ceiling and then come back down again. Francis Donnelly himself was badly injured and he died in hospital the next day. On the way out, the IRA men opened fire on his wife, who was standing with another baby in her arms. And this is the brutality of the First World War appearing on the streets of Brown Square. So the days of Brown Square being the days where people could have a fight, throw a few stones, is gone. It's now down to this, where everyone's a target. It's total war, as they say. Doesn't matter what age you are. This one, you're going to pass, as you pass Millfield, they deliberately merged this picture because these houses used to be what was known as the Catholic houses. They're the only ones that were left, and now, well, we don't know who lives in them. They are now mixed housing. This is looking up towards Carrickhill, and this took place just here. So right, this is Brown Street. Remember Brown Street again, same place, and this happened just here. And this is the diary of Frederick Crawford. I observed the huddled figure of a woman lying face down the pavement in front of a pub along the far side of Brown Street. When crossing Brown Street, there was a hostile crowd, about 100 halfway up the street. When we got her to the door, I turned her around to carry her and saw blood oozing from a wound in her left groin. I then ran over to Brown Square and called up the crowd to send at once for an ambulance, as the woman who was shot and badly wounded. However, the indignation was so strong against all in Millfield after the murder of the constable, that not one of them moved. And after I'd repeated my request several times, the hooligan element started to menace me. The woman was Lizzie Donnelly from West Street, and she died the next day in hospital. And the only thing that saved Fred Crawford that day was he had his UVF armband, and he put that on, because there was sniping coming all the way down the street. You know, the snipers of the battlefields had turned up in Brown Square, and they were shooting anyone who got in their way, because they knew that anyone walking along here would have been Catholic, because the area had been segregated. So this is the culmination of 100 years of hatred. So just prior to what had happened there, 2 B specials of the Royal Art, and this is the one. So this happened here. So it became a Pat Carroll's bar, but at the time it was a shop. 2 B special constables of the Royal Ulster Constabulary have been shot at the corner of Millfield and Peters Hill by 2 IRA men who ran down Millfield, went into a shop to hide just before the corner of Wilson Street, just here. One of the B specials, William Roston, died and the other was gravely wounded. Crawford takes up the story of the IRA men's fate. We walked along, and when we came opposite the shop where the rifles had been thrown, there was a great big pool of blood in the middle of the road, more than an inch deep in the centre, and a set of upper jaw teeth split in 2, lying in the middle of it. I stopped to examine the spot, and the big policeman said to me, "It's all right, sir. We got 3 of them out of that house. We blew the head off one, left one not worth lifting, and wounded another." The RUC man also indicated that it was only the presence of the British Army that stopped even greater retaliation. Crawford goes on. He complained bitterly of the interference of the military with them in doing their duty, and gave me several instances of when the military stopped them from doing really good work. Really good work being murder, and essentially. So hopefully that'll throw some doubt on what happened with the British Army. What happened at Brown Square? Same thing. Boyd Street, that had become mixed, because up here you have the Catholic area. So these are all the Catholic houses. 3 were killed here, and all these houses were burnt out. So you can just see this is the 1930s. So here you can see the RUC, and you can see there's now it was a furniture warehouse that was built where the Catholic houses had been. So ethnic cleansing had taken place. So how many were killed at Brown Square? Well, almost 10% of all the deaths in the north of Ireland happened at Brown Square, 52 in total. And I have them noted down here. So killed in New Lodge Road, killed in North Street, Weil Avenue, killed in Carrickhill, Peters Hill, Millfield. You can see the greatest numbers, Millfield, Letitia Street, killed in Brown Street, killed in Divis Street. So Brown Square had become the killing fields of the 1920s. And it had to come to an end. And it came to an end because, first of all, the War of Independence had taken on such an effect in the south that IRA men had stopped coming north. In fact, IRA men had been encouraged to go south to help out, whether or not, I'm not going to tonight, pro or anti-treaty. But the British are, but the new Northern Ireland government then brought in the Special Powers Act, which even in the 1990s, the South African government said they wished they had it. It was so draconian. They had the B specials. They also had the C specials if they needed them. They had the RUC, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, which is effectively a paramilitary police force. And they also used internment. And that's why I'm glad that Mike can join us tonight. And these are his photographs. So they interned these prisoners in Ballykilner, and they would have interned these prisoners in these huts, which would have been the same huts that James Patterson and the UVF would have been in when he trained there in 1915 and 1914. So an irony of ironies, you know, the IRA men ended up in the same huts, albeit with a wire fence surrounding them. So a great connection. How do we know this? Well, if you have a wee look, this is known as the World's End Camp, which I can appreciate, but for me, the World's End Camp was always going to be McGilligan because it was always freezing when I was there. But yeah, I spent time in these huts in Ballykilner. But you can see the first name here is Eamon O'Quinn, 55 Old Lodge Road. And what I've done is actually break it down into who were the IRA. So you can see that there was 101 who were active service here in or around the major Brown Square area, of which 37 were Fianna, the boys. They would have carried out most of the incendiary work. And if you think about where the Belfast TAC is today, they were formed in a small tobacconist shop just there. So a UVF gun range was behind them, and they formed the original Fianna Boys IRA just there. After the treaty, one of the misconceptions is that because of what was going on in the south, that a lot of active service IRA went south. It's not true. 19% went south, but essentially by 1922, as Jimmy McDermott himself agrees, the war was over for the IRA. Partition was going to happen. The big question is what they were going to do after the war. So if you go to Brown Square today, those same peace walls from 1921 are still there today. So that's where the Catholic houses were in Boyd Street. They were burnt out. This is the same place, only we're Mayan Millfield, where St. Stephen's Church is. And this is Peter's Hill, where the rest of the Catholic houses were. And this is one of the original walls from 1921, a peace wall that was built between Letitia Street, which is the Catholic area, and Bilton Place. And it's still there today, if you go down and have a good look. And it's a group of American students from St. Francis Loyola University in Los Angeles. So what happened? Well, George Kyle, or Sam Kyle, as I say, he actually did get elected. And after 1920, there was a period where people began to have class politics again. Troops that came home, some of whom were able to get in the B specials like James Patterson, but a lot didn't. So they were literally unemployed. Shipyards were in a slump. There was no work. And stepped forward someone who had only talked about it now, because he had seen how ill-treated the soldiers from every side were. So not just the UVF, but the 16th Irish as well, the 10th Standard Division. And one of the things that I've seen from Richard Grayson, and I haven't had time to put it on tonight, was I asked Richard, would he encompass all the men who served from across all the areas down here? So Alton Street, Stanhope Street, Hummel Street, John Street. And I got an extreme shock. And I'll try and include that for just a short time next week, because Richard's also very kindly provided an analysis. And you'll get a real shock, because what I realized was the amount of men who had served at the front, who were Catholics, who had came home, who couldn't get a job. And they had literally written out of history, So along steps this man, Philip Woods. And he is one of those conundrums, because he should be a hero, but he isn't. He was educated at the Inst, okay, and he went to the School of Art. He worked in his family's textile firm. He fought as an underage, he volunteered underage in the Boer War along with Baden Powell. It's not confirmed, but it's most probable that Woods was in the UVF, including some gun running, but we don't want to nail that one down, and maybe Nick can firm that up at the end. He joined the 36th Ulster Division. He commanded along with Crozier. He was commanded not to accompany the 36th on the 1st of July at the Battle of the Somme because they didn't want the officers killed on the first wave. But he did need a support group on the 2nd to relieve the front line. And he was supposed to come back, but didn't, and fought over into the 3rd. And if you look at the command orders, he really did lead a fighting retreat. So he's one person who should be remembered because he really did save what was left of the Ulster Division. He led the 9th Belfast Battalion of the RIR, and in fact the RIR, at the Battle of Messines, which was the most successful battle that they had. They took every position, and he did it because he had trained the men without fear or favour. And I really suspect that, and I think I can guess, and I'm hoping Nick's going to back me up, that he promoted men on their abilities, not their religion. And so therefore that wouldn't have went down too well within the 36th Ulster Division. But he apparently was also a very prickly character. You know, one says white, he says black. But either way, he still led the 36th Ulster Division. In June 1918, he was part of a Murmansk force. So he was asked, would he volunteer to go and fight in Russia, okay, what was in Karelia. So his task was to obstruct the Vienna expedition by German officered White Finn forces, threatening East Karelia and the Murmansk Railway. He operated out of Kem in the White Sea, and he established a Karelian regiment supplied and officered by the British, which were known as the Royal Irish Karelians. They adopted a regimental badge designed by Woods, with a green shamrock on an orange field, which he literally cut out of a billiard table, the green baize. That's how they got their badge. And with this force, he's able to push the Germans and the Finns and established in Utia out of White Karelia. The success with Karelians fostered unrealistic hopes of national self-determination. And in the end, the Karelians were betrayed, in a word, by the British Foreign Office. So he was really bitterly disappointed in that. He then went to Lithuania. And again, these photographs are down to Nick and the Woods family. So Crozier, so the commander, Percy Crozier, is there, and there's Colonel Woods. And this is in Lithuania. As I say, became known as the King of Karelia. He then came home and seen what conditions were like for those men that he led at the Battle of the Somme and over the top at Messines. And once he seen what was happening, he stood as a fighting colonel and was elected in a by-election in May 1923 for Belfast West, following the assassination of William Tyrrell, sitting MP. We now know that the IRA shot, as Seamus Wood shot William Tyrrell, where Tyrrell Avenue comes from. Now, that should have been a shoe-in for the Unionist establishment here. They could have put a donkey up and it would have been elected. And yet Woods was elected because what he did was he campaigned both on the Shankill, on the Fall and on the Falls, and anywhere that he thought he would get votes from ex-servicemen, regardless of what their religion. And so this is an unbelievable election poster. So he would have campaigned at Brown Square, and this was his election. An ex-serviceman for ex-servicemen, working men, and their dependents. Now, if anything says anything about the character of the man, that's it. You know, for anybody who lives, I know Jerry's on the call tonight, if you imagine, you know, the most famous man to go to Hamel Street and try to be elected was Eamon de Valera, for example. And, you know, Ono Duffy had been there. And then all of a sudden you have a British colonel and he got elected. And that's what got elected. That's how he got elected. And one of the things that really struck me in reading Nick's book was about he refused to go over the Ulster Tower because he believed it was just whenever it was opened in 1921, I think, because he believed that it was a ploy. And it was a way for men who had never served their country, who had literally made millions out of the war, who were industrious, who had, you know, ran men into the ground and women. They could build this memorial, and they were there, and they could sort of share in the glory. And he could see that it was partly a trick. It was a trick to try and take the honour from what happened, you know. That's in my opinion as an ex-soldier. And I came across this. So here you have Ian Paisley doing the same thing in 1986. And this is with, as you can see, Nigel Dodge, Fred Proctor, Jackie Hewitt signing the book. And this is actually inside the Ulster Tower. And to give you an idea of how potent that is as a symbol, and it's a badge. And if you ever read my book on the shipyard about why I won't wear a poppy, except on one day per year, this is another example of how something that was a sacrifice has become a symbol of something else. Because here you have the Ulster Tower Memorial COVID mask. Now, how you put those two together, I don't know. And for me, I think it's a sham, a disgrace. But that's just my personal opinion. So to finish off, I've run over a wee bit here, sorry. Just some takeaway points before we move into next week. The Brown Square violence had evolved from mostly unarmed raiding to sniping, bombing. So rather than killers and murders, it became labelled to make it easier to happen. So you had defenders, you had reprisals instead of massacres, you had random killings, especially aimed at the Catholic population, because if you couldn't get, you know, as one of the district inspectors said, well, if you can't get the right Sinn Féiner, if you shoot a few, you'll probably get the right one at the end. So this random killing became part of something that happened then in the 1970s. And you also have peacekeeping killings. For example, the British Army shot a sergeant dead from Brown Square Barracks because they seen him drawing his weapon at night. And a soldier being a soldier just went, well, that's my orders are to open fire. So the front line was still usual suspects, but it now spread across working class areas, even as far as in the Glens of Antrim. So there was 3 killings in a lovely place called Cushion Doll that I'm still looking into, by the way, and I'm hoping John Robbins on tonight is going to give us a hand with that. So the killing fields of Brown Square had evolved into the lovely Glens of Antrim. There are a renewed siege mentality had evolved amongst Protestants. I call it Dariaism. You know, that if we don't build these walls like the Hebrews did, you know, the Jews did, then the monsters of the Republic are going to come over. But for Catholics, they had a sense of abandonment by the Free State. And they couldn't really identify with this new Northern Ireland because nobody tried to identify them with this new Northern Ireland. It essentially was a Protestant state for Protestant people. And as approved with Owen O'Duffy being the Garda Commissioner, down south wasn't exactly a happy place for Protestants either. So it was an ideal way for some to say, well, what we'll do is we'll have just a Protestant state and a Catholic state. And it suited some people's agendas to do that. For Unionists and Nationalist Republicans, the threat and use of violence could and did change the policy of the United Kingdom government. For example, it had broken the Act of Union. So the threat or use of violence works. That's one of the takeaway points. For Northern Ireland Unionists, the former security of the British Army being able to deal with Republicans was gone. Remember, when they deployed, they literally killed all around them. And they tried to reinstate that security with their own paramilitary police forces, and most importantly, the Special Powers Act. For Unionists, the evolved strategy of paramilitary type policing, supported by locally raised B specials, backed up the Special Powers Act and internment, had worked in the defeat of the IRA. And that's an important point because whenever we get on to 1969, that's exactly what some of these unionist politicians thought. Well, we already know how to deal with this. We know what we have. We know what we can do. If we just do the same thing again, we're going to get the same result. But as we all know, that's not what happened. So just to finish off, I can't explain half of what I've discovered tonight. The only person I've ever come close is this man here. He's a poet called Louis McNeeson. He wrote a poem called Autumn Journal. And if you read it, I think it's Canto 27, it puts in print what actually I experienced even when I was a boy, and what he experienced when he was a boy. And unfortunately, even today, if you look at the news tonight, it's not the same. Things have definitely improved, but it's not over till it's over. So I'm going to stop there.